Hey everybody, welcome back to Logstica. This is the second part in the beekeeping series, and I'm actually probably going to put up a third episode later this week because last week wasn't able to make a video. So this time what I'm going to be talking about chiefly is different breeds. And it's very important to note that breeds and species are not the same thing. Some people refer to them as subspecies. I personally actually think that breeds makes more sense because a lot of the differences have nothing to do with physiology and everything to do with temperament and behavior. And I think that is more applicable. Oh, I need to turn that light on. More applicable to breeds rather than to subspecies. Now, just to be clear, when we're talking about beekeeping and anything of the sort, because I have had people ask me about what are clearly other species and even different genera, talking about Apis mellifera, which is the European honeybee. That's what that means. I will be including Africanized bees in this because I do consider them to be pretty much the same thing. So here we go. Let me start with what I think is the best beginner species, unless you live in like Maine or something. It was my beginner species, in fact, and that is Apis mellifera Logstica. That's the Italian honeybee. Here's the thing. Here's the downside. In the spring, they make a lot of babies, and they don't necessarily have enough to feed them. So in the early spring, which is kind of when you first get them, you might have to feed them with like sugar water or something in order to just ensure that they do okay. And another thing, they are more prone than other bees to raid their neighbors. They will do that. So you might want to keep them a little further away if you're planning on keeping multiple hives. So those are the two big things. Some people also say they're weaker against like wasps and stuff, but I've not personally noticed that. But you know, now here's the great thing about them, though. This is why I think they're a great beginner species. They are easily the most chill of all of them. In fact, I would say that they're like the Labrador of bees. So you know, if we're comparing them to dog breeds. Another great example, especially with all this talk about disease and parasites and things, Russian bees. Now, here's the downside to Russian bees. They are definitely more aggressive than Italians, and they make a lot of babies only when there's a lot of food. So they're kind of like the opposite in that sense to Italians. The big downside to that means that if there's not a lot going on in the surroundings, like let's say there's just sort of a dead part of the season, like a drought, or just, there's just not a lot of flowers in bloom at the time, their population is going to drop quite a bit. And if that's in the middle of the year, that can really curtail their ability to survive the winter. That being said, they're very cold hardy. Obviously, they're from Russia, so that makes sense. But the real pro to them is mites and disease. They're just much more resilient to. So that's the big thing. Let's see, Carney Owens. I really recommend Carney Owens as a beginner, and even if you're not a beginner and you're just curious about experimenting with other breeds, Carney Owens are great. They're very chill. They actually have a great head start in spring, which is one of the reasons why they're also so popular. And they can actually, and this is where I said that there are sometimes physiological differences. Their proboscis, their little tongue-like organ, it's actually longer than your average bee. Not much. We're talking about a fraction of a millimeter. But that can make all the difference when it comes to, like, for example, my bees, I don't have any Carney Owens right now. They will pollinate white clover, but when that clover flower gets bigger and purple, they don't mess with it because they can't reach. Well, so the bumblebees, they're what you always see on red clover where I'm at. They don't have a problem with that. Carney Owens will absolutely pollinate red clover. So once the flower gets too big for like your average bee strain, so yeah, that's a huge plus. I can't even think of any downsides to them. I've really been on the cusp of wanting to experiment more with them, and if it turns out well, I'll probably recommend them over Italians. Lastly out of the good ones that I'm going to recommend is the Buckfast. Buckfast comes from Britain. It was actually made at Buckfast Abbey by a fellow named Brother Adam, and it's because tracheal mites, early 20th century, were absolutely destroying bee colonies, And this guy changed the game. Like, he bred buckfast bees, which were resistant to a lot of those parasites, and he also made them just a hardier species. So, yeah, I mean, huge advantages. The only downside to buckfasts, compared to everything else I've mentioned, they're probably the most aggressive of the ones I've mentioned, which is not much. That's not a bad thing. Now we've got the two that I'm less inclined to recommend. The German, Apis mellifera. That's the one that came here on the flippin' Mayflower. I like German bees in the wild. I encourage people to call local beekeepers when they see a wild swarm. It's probably Germans. They're very important at this point because they outcompeted, when they came on the Mayflower, when they were what the natives called the white man's fly, they outcompeted a lot of the natural pollinators and actually drove them to extinction, which is a bad thing, but I mean, it's already happened. And now they're an important niche in our ecosystem, so they're important. They're the wild bees that people capture when people capture strains, or wild colonies, rather. Now, that's important to note. If you want to capture one, go for it. It's a free colony, buy some queen pheromone, etc. But if you want to actually spend money and buy a beehive, don't buy a German. They're tough, they're resilient, but they are more aggressive than buckfasts. You don't really know what the genetics are going to be if they're wild. They could actually have, and I'm using this as a segue to the Africanized bee, aka what the media calls the killer bee. I do not use that word. If we're using breeds as an example, this is the pit bull. This is the one that the news loves to talk about, but doesn't necessarily. By the way, I'm steering clear of the whole pit bull conundrum. I'm not talking about it. I'm just saying that's kind of what this is like. Because a pit bull is a dog. It's a dog. It displays more aggression in certain circumstances, right? Killer bees do not kill people. They don't have like magic venom that will just drop you dead. The only difference between a killer bee, there I go using it. The only difference between Apis mellifera scutellata, aka the Africanized bee, is, by the way, it's also not even African. It's actually from Brazil, but they used African DNA from a strain that was found there. But anyway, they are more aggressive. That's really it. Like, if I open my Italian hive, they start talking to each other immediately with pheromones. They start immediately trying to rile each other up. There's somebody here. We smell a mammal. Something's up. Then I smoke them. Then they calm down. I can use bare hands on the frames, and I always do because I don't want to smush any of them. And they're very cool. They're more curious than angry at that point. Africanized bees, not only do they get riled up faster, they send much more workers to attack, and they will chase you for a longer period. You can run like 100, 200 feet from a hive of Italians. You have to run a long way to get away from the Africanized bees. That's the only difference. You could actually keep these. It wouldn't be that big of a deal if you kept these, if you were experienced. I have no desire to keep them, personally, and I don't think a beginner should actively try and have any, but it's not nearly as bad as the media makes it out to be. They're still honeybees. That's what they are. So ultimately, like, if I had to recommend any, if you live in a warm climate, go with the Italians, or if you live pretty much anywhere, you can go with buckfast or Carney Owens. I really, really recommend Carney Owens, which may be hypocritical since I don't currently keep any Carney Owens. And if you're real worried about parasites, Russians you can't go wrong with, although they are aggressive compared to others. But do not actively seek out, if you're a beginner, Germans or Africanized. I don't recommend it. There's also Caucasian bees. I have no idea about them. They're the only strain I have no experience with at all, and so I have no intention of talking about them. I haven't heard really good things from others, and I know that they've mixed with Carney Owens a lot in a lot of places, which may have a tremendous effect on their behavior and temperament. But that's really all I have to say about choosing a strain for this episode. And I'm trying to think if there's anything else. Next episode, probably going to cover bee diseases, which makes me think of Sanford and Son. Bees and disease do you do, or whatever. But other than that, and I'm probably going to post that one in the next couple of days in lieu of the Sunday Q&A normally, because last week, I wasn't able to post. So, like, share, subscribe, keep asking questions. Bye.